want to keep this microphone away from my magnet. Those of you who were with us last night will know what I'm talking about. My name is Bill McGovern. I'm the interim dean of the law school and the Gray Plant Moody and Bennett Professor of Law. And one of the fun things you get to do when you're being a dean is you get to welcome people to the exciting events that the law school gets to convene. And we have a real full house here of excited, enthusiastic advocates and experts. And I'm delighted to see you. So on behalf of our faculty and our staff and students here, welcome to today's Fall Immigration Forum, brought to you, of course, by the James H. Binger Center for New Americans. Welcome. Many of you know that 10 years ago, a small group of passionate, dedicated faculty and advocates, they got together with some local law firms and some nonprofits, and with, of course, the Robina Foundation, and they came together to launch the Binger Center for New Americans, as we now call it, which later on, a few years after they proved that it was a brilliant idea, was supported by a transformative $25 million endowment from the Robina Foundation. And now Binger gets to be a part of this extraordinarily collaborative, hardworking, imaginative group here in the Twin Cities of immigration attorneys and advocates. It was really fun at last night's celebratory dinner and this morning to see so many of you greeting each other like old friends who had been, working together on these important issues for many years. And Binger Center and the law school are really proud to be able to serve as a forum to convene us all together. So for all of the people who have gone from then a decade ago to now, who have improved our immigration laws, have provided education and outreach to communities, expanded the legal services and therefore the legal options available to non-citizens, and of course, have trained a new generation of skillful immigration lawyers among our clinic students. So for all the people who have been a part of all of that work, I want to say thank you. I'd like to thank the faculty of the center. Nadia Anguiano is here, Professor Nadia Anguiano, Professor Linus Chan, and Assistant Dean of Clinical Education and Professor Steve Miley are all here. So are our legal fellows, Mackenzie Heinrichs and Seiko Shastri are here. And I want to thank all of them for their work putting today's events together and for their work making the Binger Center an extraordinary resource for our community. So join me in thanking them. And I'd also like to thank everyone who made today's conference possible and make the Binger Center possible, make it run every day, particularly Mahmoud Ahmad, the executive director, not executive director, operations director. We're getting to you, Sarah, and Teresa Pedron, who I think is probably still at the table outside working hard. Thank you to both of you, and now thank you also to the executive director of the Binger Center, Sarah Brennis, whose coordination and efforts made all of this weekend's activities possible. So thank you. Join me in thanking Mahmoud and Teresa and Sarah. This has been quite a decade of the Binger Center's existence when it comes to immigration law and policy. There's been a few things that have happened in this last decade, as everyone in this room is well aware. We've had increased migration flows, we've had DACA, family separation, changing guidelines for removal of non-citizens, and many more developments. So today is an opportunity to look to the past and look back on some of those and some of the ways that this community and the immigration bar in general have responded successfully, and also to look towards the future, to think about what the next challenges might be, and to get together, convening together at the law school in order to be imaginative and share experience and knowledge and ideas about what the next decade might look like and how we might be there as we have been for this past decade on behalf of the non-citizen clients who need your work so desperately. So I hope that today offers you that sense of perspective and that inspiration. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the impresario of the day, Executive Director Sarah Brenes.
Thanks, everyone. I'm already we're eating into the time of our first panel, so I'll be really brief and just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Thanks to everyone who helped plan the event and to our fabulous speakers. We have a really great lineup, and we're really challenging ourselves today to think about the influx of immigrants that are arriving and reminding ourselves that this isn't the first time that we've been here. We as a country struggle to learn from history and improve things, but we're going to reflect on that and really think outside the box as well. We've got some great panels with really some technical lawyering panels, but also experts from other fields to help us think about how we can respond in a way that makes Minnesota more welcoming to new arrivals that are coming to the United States and really making it a safe place for immigrants. So a couple logistical things. We have a paper program. There's also a QR code that has a program that links to the bios for the speakers. And let us know if you have any questions throughout the day. But I'm really excited to welcome our first panel that will give us some historical context and the show running. So thanks so much.
If we can get the show running, because I've been given many microphones and clickers and things. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. This is so much fun to watch as I was just sitting here watching people come in, seeing so many people who have been doing this much longer than I have, and who continue to have the energy and the vision and the fight to have resistance, to have resilience, and resolve to make our world a better place. My name is Michelle Garnett McKenzie. I'm a deputy director at the Advocates for Human Rights, and we are going to be talking about the past because we need to ground ourselves in some way of thinking that we can do better. Right? And that we created the past in some ways. We have power to change things. We have power to create things. And so with me, do you two just want to introduce yourselves as we go along here? So I'll be starting with the sort of historical roots of U.S. immigration policy. And unfortunately, our colleague Rochelle King is sick in bed. I'm less sick, so I could come, but we both had colds this week. So I'll just transition a little bit about our refugee protection system and then turn things over to Craig. So Craig, who are you and what will you be talking about?
Good morning. My name is Craig Moosen. I am an adjunct professor of law at DePaul University, teaching refugee and asylum work. I also, prior to DePaul, directed the Midwest Immigrant Rights Center, which has since grown into the National Immigrant Justice Center. And I also am ordained in the United Church of Christ. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the sanctuary movement of the early 80s and also a retrospective of what it was like to do asylum work immediately after the enactment of the 1980 Refugee Act.
Udo.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Edmundo Liho. I'm an assistant city attorney with the city of St. Paul, but I run the immigrant and refugee program for the city of St. Paul. And prior to joining the city in 2019, I was an immigration attorney in private practice in St. Paul for about 2 decades. And before that, I lived in El Paso, Texas, where I was an assistant county attorney and worked on a lot of border issues with the county of El Paso.
And we all, I think, are united in congratulating the Binger Center on 10 years and know we have 100 years more of work together. So we are glad you will be here long into the future. So as we look at immigration and think about the challenges of human migration, we have to remember that people move. That is what we do. People are not an immigration problem. People aren't immigration laws. It's just what we do as human beings. Migration is an essentially human endeavor. And estimates are that people have moved for 100,000 years or more. Probably we'll learn more and more about that migration. But the reasons for migration are the same today as they were all along, right? People need food and they see food over there, so they go get food. They need to mate with somebody outside their group, so they go find family somewhere else. That's why my teenage son is my son, right? So, right, you have to, people move around for family. That's how we survived as a species. People move for fun. Sometimes you just want to see what's over the hill. And too often people move for flight, for famine, for reasons that are pushing them beyond their control. But the numbers today are pretty astonishing. There are 5.4 million asylum seekers in the world, 35 million refugees, 62.5 million people who were internally displaced inside their countries. They didn't even make it to an international border, but they are not living in their homes because of civil strife or some other conflict or disaster that has caused them to move. And there are 281 million people estimated to be in international migration right now. That is an astonishingly large number of people. 281 million people is almost the population, I guess, 100 million short of the US. Well, no, that's not true. We're 330 billion. So never mind. But it's a lot of people, right? So that's a challenge on our global immigration system. But when you put it in perspective, it's still about 3% of the world's population, right? Most people stay home. If you're from Minnesota, you know how we stay home, right? People don't move. When we think people move, not Minnesotans. And if you're new to Minnesota, you suddenly become pulled into our tractor beam, right? But so the reality is a lot of people don't move. And we have to think about migration in terms of the people who live in community as well. People in the countries that produce migration, in transit, and in receiving communities as well. But again, it's a human reality. And with a combination of a increasingly large world population, there just are more people on the planet than there have been. Increasing mobility. 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you couldn't get on an airplane. Right? Ships were much longer in journey. People didn't move as far and couldn't move as far as they can today. And really continued economic disparities and other just horrific adverse drivers of migration, climate change, war and conflict, starvation and famine, things that are created by human beings and for which we are responsible. People will continue to be on the move. The US immigration policy arose at a particular moment in time, and our US immigration laws are really used to create and reinforce our national identity. And we have to think about that and kind of own that. And I just wanted to point out kind of a few key signposts in history that kind of reflect where we are. And my contention is really that our immigration system isn't broken at all. It's designed to do exactly what it's doing, right? And it started off with a Naturalization Act that said that free white persons could be citizens. Free white persons could naturalize. So whiteness and racism and white supremacy was like the first and foremost thought on people's minds when we created our immigration system. By the early 1800s, troops were here at Fort Snelling. Amy Lang here, who runs our port observation program, knows Fort Snelling is today the spot of deportations. The deportation hearings take place out at Fort Snelling. It's also the most sacred spot of the convergence of the rivers for the Dakota people. And it was a strategic military outpost. Immigration was used as a tool of colonization and settlement during that time and throughout the 1800s in Minnesota, right? That we were trying to displace Native people and replace them with immigrants, with strategic recruitment campaigns, really trying to get people to come to Minnesota. And as Union power would rise up with one group, we'd bring in another group of people to crush that. Colonization and settlement was part of the strategy to create the national myth, the national identity we have. And that's a reality. We also moved into an age of exclusion. By the late 1800s, we had the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act that any of you who've taken immigration classes know about, that really moved into a complete Asiatic barred zone that didn't fully lift until the 1950s, completely barring people from a wide range of countries from becoming citizens and thereby being eligible to immigrate to the US. Alongside that, the same year, we had other exclusion acts that still are on the books today, things that kept people out of the US because of poverty or because they'd be likely to become a public charge, because of depravity, because of all sorts of categories we wanted to exclude, but really targeted at trying to tighten up who could be here as part of our desirable national identity. And by 1924, we had our immigration quota system in place. Really purpose-built to make sure that the United States retained a national identity a racial identity and a religious identity that it wanted to. This was a policy decision that was made to make sure that Northern Europeans were really privileged in the number of visas that were available. And it wasn't by a little bit. The UK, Germany, Northern European countries were able to immigrate in the tens of thousands per year, and other countries had 100 visas a year. So it really shaped who we are and who we became. And there's so much more, of course, to immigration history that some of the historians in the room can talk about. I know, Linus, you've talked about this extensively, and there's a link, I think, Linda provided at the end of the presentation. So in your homework notes, your extra credit, is that what you call it? Extra credit, you called it. You can dig into, but just know that we made choices and we made investments to really reinforce who we are and what our system was. So we did have one massive immigration reform act. This is our most recent comprehensive immigration reform, 1965. And in 1965, we wanted and needed to reject the overt racial exclusion laws and national origin quotas. They were discordant with the times in which they were sitting, but we didn't want to actually get rid of them. We just wanted to not say them. And US immigration laws really shifted to family-based priorities and to some extent employment-based priorities for the purpose of retaining the racial balance of the United States. There were other solutions that were in discussion in Congress at the time, but the family-based immigration system was adopted because it was the least disruptive to that entrenched national identity that Congress wanted to perpetuate, and that the people, that was definitely that racist tendency was continuing and permeating our immigration laws. So the residue of those predecessor laws is embedded in something that we're operating under today. When I started practicing immigration law, I thought, this is, we have these core values of family and employment and freedom of asylum laws. And as you get to know, that family-based choice was really something that wasn't for the benefit of families particularly. It was for a different purpose. Now, that is the last big comprehensive immigration reform. The immigration law we have today is the one negotiated in 1965. Luckily, nothing else has changed in the world since that time, so it's working great. And just, I think as we move out of history, just remember that the system isn't broken. right? It's designed to do what it's doing. It's designed to exclude and expel people. It has few regular migration channels. There just aren't very many ways you can move into the United States or freely around into many other countries. There's no mechanism that's available for handling in a sensible, predictable, sort of accessible way climate, disaster, or other conflict-driven migration. And we really saw this fall apart with the Afghan evacuation and with the Ukraine evacuation. We saw we had to come up with things called parole that were temporary solutions where we could have had something that worked on a much more predictable and less traumatic basis. There are so many ways you can fall out of immigration status and virtually no way once you've fallen out to regain it. That's a really interesting choice. You can fall out of status for anything. You bagpipe and get money, for working while you were on your H-1B and it wasn't your employer. That did totally, my husband never did that. But you can fall out of status for many ways, and it's really almost impossible to get back into immigration status. It's set up to exclude and expel. And we've over-resourced our enforcement and completely starved our adjudications in a deliberate and strategic way to, I think, create a space where we can't, it's not tenable, as you see this with massive backlogs. So as we think about public policy in immigration, at no point in what I described were human rights or human dignity part of the equation. Right? That was not on the table. That is not something that our policymakers were thinking of. They really were thinking about national identity and control and other factors, but never how do the people in migration experience that. And I think we have an opportunity to do something different. And we saw a little bit of a light in the 1970s and 80s when the US finally enacted the Refugee Convention. The 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees was enacted finally, it brought into law in 1980. And I'm going to transition over to Craig now, but with really this spirit that there is something beyond national sovereignty and the exclusion mentality that can be infused into our immigration laws. And we can protect people from human rights violations. Whether we do that or whether we outright reject that for political reasons, another story. So I think that's where I'll turn off and turn things over to Craig. There's just an advance.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. It was really great to celebrate last night and to hear your many great accomplishments. So congratulations. And Dean, I do have one grievance, if I'm allowed to make that publicly, that you all stole Linus Chan from us from DePaul University. And we're still trying to recover after that, but it's good to know the great work he's doing up here. And I thank him for his colleagueship and his great work. So thank you. Now, at the risk of sounding like your grandfather that walked 10 miles to school, both back and forth, uphill both ways, given all of your great accomplishments, I really want you to try to imagine what it was like in 1980 when the Refugee Act was enacted. And most of you are a lot younger than I am, so it's going to have, if I had a Harry Potter wand to say, go back and think about that. But let me just be that grandfather for a second. My first year of law school, I typed all my papers and briefs on a manual typewriter, right? Now we can laugh at that and ask what the word type is and writer is, but think about what that means is that once you did your first draft and had a second one, you had to retype the entire draft all over again and all the site checking and proofreading to make sure there weren't any errors. And then a third one. And so your timing of just putting something together like a brief was amazingly difficult. When I went to my first social service job working as a lawyer, we had a thing called an IBM Selectric, which was magical. It had one little button that would go back one space and correct the letter so you could retype without having you do the whole page. Wow, that was amazing. You could get work done and correct your mistakes and move ahead. My first year of law school, there were 2 small desks in the library, and they had this new thing called Westlaw. And it was kind of like people were like, what do you do with that? And try to figure out electronic research of law. So I want to just, again, the practical side of practice in that kind of environment of putting things together. We still had fax machines or things. That was a big modern invention and that sort of thing. So I'm not asking that to feel sorry for me. I mean, it was, builds character, I guess. But it is kind of trying to think back what it was like to practice. There weren't a lot of the national organizations or even the organizations like yours that were available to do this kind of work. There were private immigration attorneys, and there were a few organizations that tried to. The organization that I joined actually went back to Jane Addams and her League for the Protection of Immigrants. And but it was mostly a social service agency, and we were trying to do some law in that. So I have a few lessons learned that I'd like to share with you. And I was asked to do both things. As I mentioned, I'm both an attorney and an ordained United Church of Christ pastor. And those stories for me also reflect kind of the history of what happened in the 1980s. As Michelle said, one of these what lawyers don't do a lot of is Section 207 of the Refugee Act, which is involved with overseas refugee resettlement. Now, I know some of you here do that work, but I raise that. I want to just, for a second, if I can go back, that's real quick, sort of the ways of what happens in resettlement. Work is done overseas. I've actually gone to Jordan and I've gone to Lesbos in Greece to work with Syrian refugees to try to get them in the queue for overseas resettlement. There's about 2 years of vetting people to make sure they get through, to make sure we're secure, that there's no Trojan horse here of someone coming in as a terrorist, as a refugee. And then if you miss a step, you got to go back and start all over again. So some of the refugees I worked with in Jordan had been years, and then they have to redo all their, and it's like 8 or 10 different federal agencies that have to check out your biometrics, your eye, your fingerprints, and the like. Then you can come here and work with mostly non-lawyer agencies to do resettlement and then get English language job training in that sense. I would like to give a shout out to Dr. Ed Silverman from Illinois. When this program started, he helped build the Overseas Refugee Resettlement Program in Illinois, which then became a national model. And he was a friend, a mentor of mine, but I never want to get away from people like that really at the very beginning saw this. And the reason I raise that in the context here, because us lawyers don't do a lot, is the first few years of the Refugee Act, 200,000 refugees resettled, 200,000. Now, some of those were from the Vietnam War, and there were different ways. It then kind of settled into a period of 125,000 a year. We can be a generous nation. We have ways of doing it. Come to Chicago and go on Argyle Street and see Little Vietnam, right? Or come to Rogers Park and see all the Bosnians. The vibrancy of, I'm sure here with Somalis or others that you have in your community. But under the Trump administration, it went down to 10,000. Now, President Biden has promised to go back to 125,000, but we still haven't gotten much over 20, 30, or 40,000 a year. And that's non-controversial. After the vetting, they get to come in, get to be part of our communities. And so that's one lesson, is that we can be generous and we can do really wonders. So I celebrate that and just remind ourselves that we have been generous, even with a broken system. I'll use that, I'm going to quote you now. We're not broken, it was designed, but we have ways of doing this. So I'm going to get to the Refugee Act. And went the wrong way. Going the wrong way. All right, you get a preview there. All right, we skipped one there. Okay. March 23rd, March 17th, 1980 was the Refugee Act. It was enacted. We'd signed the protocol in 67. It took all that time to get a law that said we would then recognize this world definition of someone who could get asylum if they had either been persecuted or had a well-founded fear of persecution, if they're outside of their country and fear to be on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. Been doing this for 40 years. I still need all 5 fingers, right? Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. And so we had this great way of what's going to happen. We're going to move in. Congress thought there wouldn't be much change. We'd still get a few thousand refugees a year through this program. Not a big deal. So March 17th, 1980 becomes law. March 23rd, 1980, Archbishop Arnulfo Romero gave a sermon telling the Salvadoran military, put down your arms, follow God's law, thou shalt not kill. Very next day, he was assassinated by people trained at the United States School of the Americas. A few months later, December 2nd, 1984, North American Churchwoman. Ida Ford, Maura Clark, Jean Donovan, and Dorothy Cazell were murdered in El Salvador. Civil wars in Salvador and Guatemala changed the work we had to do. Instead of Congress thinking there'd be 10 or 20 or 30, a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand, those deaths were deaths of people we knew. But the tens of thousands other who disappeared or murdered sent people to our wars. And so the story becomes first a religious one because the lawyers, we didn't know how to respond. And so the churches started going. The Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson all of a sudden started seeing many Salvadorans at their door. And all of a sudden had thousands. They declared the first public sanctuary of a church. We will house Salvadorans because the United States government is not living up to the law. And we feel called by the gospel that says to love your neighbor. We'll be called by the Hebrew Bible that says, do not treat the native and the stranger the same. Do not treat them differently. And our laws treat them differently. Church in Chicago, Wellington Avenue, United Church of Christ. Oh, that's why it's missing. All right. Decided after several months of discernment to open a sanctuary. That's my church now, but it wasn't at the time. The slide that's missing is we sent a letter to Attorney General Smith, William French Smith, on July 18th, 1982, saying, we are declaring public sanctuary. We're bringing Salvadorans into our building. And we know we're breaking the law, but we have a higher law to follow. And part of that was urging other churches to do this. I've been told they expected the INS to show up and break down the doors, and they were prepared to do that. But they still did this. This individual, we moved him on to another church. We took another family. These people, their sons were about to get drafted by the Salvadoran military. They didn't want them to murder innocent civilians. Church. I was at another church in town in Chicago, and we went through the year-long United Church of Christ. We've got to educate, we've got to learn, we've got to do this. It changed my life. I was a labor management lawyer, and all of a sudden I met this family. They came to talk to us about what it's like to be in sanctuary. I ended up leaving my job to go to seminary and thinking I was going to become a congregational pastor. And lo and behold, I went back and did some immigration work, and they became my clients. So these things change, things happen. We eventually started to get other churches to get involved. And we had an overground railroad. Some of the clients, after we discussed in full discussion, went through and did an overground trip from Chicago to Massachusetts, stopping at churches, Mennonite assembly halls, Quaker halls, other churches, to talk about what is your role as a Christian. Tens of thousands of people are being disappeared and murdered with no human rights, and the U.S. government is not granting asylum. Thus, this movement grew to over 300 or 400 synagogues and churches around the country offering public sanctuary. Now, the Christian Science Monitor interviewed a INS officer and said, "Are you going to go bust the doors down?" And this individual, Bill Joyce, said to them, "No, we're not going to start dragging people out in front of TV cameras. We'll just wait them out. Wait until they leave the church." Well, folks, we're still here. So they can keep waiting, but I urge you to keep thinking that. Let them wait while we continue to organize. I went to seminary. I thought I'd become a congregational pastor. And then my Hebrew Bible teacher taught me about Leviticus, telling us about treating the stranger and the native. And I ended up getting a fellowship to help develop the Midwest Immigrant Rights Center. There we go. Sorry. And the idea, I was very naive. I thought I would take the summer off. I got a fellowship, recruit a few attorneys, do some pro bono cases, put up the Statue of Liberty on July 4th and say, yes, we're doing our job. And at the end of the summer, going back to school, they said, hey, can you keep working part-time and just go to seminary part-time? And ended up working there 6 years developing this organization, which I want to talk to you about, much like what you do here in Chicago or in Minneapolis with your pro bono attorneys. It's important to note how these things work together. Right? So we developed the program, got a few attorneys working on this and doing that, but still we were losing. Almost everything I'm going to tell you today comes from, and I hate to do this in the midst of celebrating, but almost everything I've learned came from losing hundreds of cases. Most lawyers don't like to admit that, right? But I did lose hundreds of Salvadoran and Guatemalan cases. In the early 1980s, 2.4% of Salvadorans obtained asylum, tried to get it. They were much more successful than Guatemalans, 0.48%. Those numbers got burned into my head as I tried to recruit you to come be a pro bono attorney. By the way, 98% of your cases will lose. By the way, 99.5% of your cases will lose. Will you come join me? And yet enough people did. And so we started this program. And one of the lessons I want to suggest is we learned a lot about how to practice. At the time in Chicago, the judges, who have often been former prosecutors, offices were in the same hall as the trial attorneys. They thought nothing of ex parte communication back and forth, right? They didn't even see themselves as real judges. They were called special inquiry officers at one point. And so what the pro bono attorneys did was help teach the judges. We told them, tell the judge, be a judge, right? And the judge would say, oh, no. I was telling someone last night, oh, by the way, we're not really like those courts here. You know, you put in all the evidence, you met your burden, and the government put in no evidence. But in a normal court, burden of proof, you had all more evidence than not, you'd win, right? He said, no, that's not here. I'm going to find your client not believable or something like that. And you'd lose. Well, those lawyers didn't back down. They're going to go. I was talking to Allison Griffith last night. She said, how do we get the 8th Circuit to be like the 7th Circuit? And I said, Judge Posner was a pretty conservative judge, but 40 years of pro bono attorneys going and knocking on the door and saying, look at the unreasonable decision of this immigration judge. And these federal litigators used to going to real courts, asking for discovery in immigration cases, and the judge is going, what? And they're standing up and saying, we need discovery. Federal litigators going in immigration court and saying, oh, trial attorney, what's the chain of custody of that document? Chain of custody, what does that mean? Right? We'd lose, but the constant refrain was make them be real judges. And pretty soon, when they weren't, we went to the 7th Circuit and appealed, and appealed, and appealed. Now, while we were still losing in all these things, the churches were moving on. And partly sponsored by Phoenix and Tucson, we filed a lawsuit. And the fear I mentioned earlier about the INS coming in, there was a fear that and Tucson, they knew they were being spied on. If you haven't gotten married yet, by the way, one of the people down there got married and their best man wore a wire for the government. How do you choose your friends like that, right? And so we thought we had a First Amendment right to say, we free exercise of religion, the government shouldn't be paying informants to come into our churches. And so we put together a national class action. My church, Wellington, was one of the plaintiff churches in that group, and said, one of the reasons we do this besides the gospel is because the government is discriminating against Salvadorans and Guatemalans. I debated an INS officer, and he said, you know, everybody knows the Poles are persecuted by the communists, so 60% of them get asylum. But those Salvadorans, they're just economic migrants, and so they shouldn't get asylum. He just was very clear that if you're fleeing a communist country, you get asylum. We said, no, there's discrimination. And then, by the way, we'll throw in this one other count here, besides our First Amendment claims, that the judges discriminated. Well, the court threw out all the First Amendment because Justice Scalia upended First Amendment law, and it's another whole story. But they left in that one count. And I was at a meeting with the National Lawyers Guild in Texas, and we're all sitting around a room. All right, now we got to go to trial on this one case. How are we going to prove an immigration judge discriminates? How do we get in their head? And we're sitting around going, we all know it in our heart. We all know it but how do you prove it? And we kept finding evidence and arguing and whatever. And what happened? In 1990, the George Bush administration settled that case, the American Baptist Church case. And I mentioned earlier, I lost all my cases. We reopened every denied Salvadoran and Guatemalan case. And that's one of the reasons that I can stand here and say, I lost a lot of cases, but we won in the end. We did hang in there. And so your resilience, your history here, and the next 30 years, I urge you to keep doing that and move on. A couple other things about just the volunteer attorneys. Without internet, how do you make documents? This is a crayon drawing from a child in a Salvadoran refugee camp in Honduras. How do you show the Rio Olimpa massacre? We didn't have internet. We didn't have lots of things. So I talked to a social worker, and she brought this child drawing. And I entered that as an exhibit. Said, this is the history of El Salvador. This is why people are fleeing. This is a child's drawing. And we got it into the evidence. And so we did things like that. And we recruited all kinds of pro bono people. Sorry, just a couple quick things. More than just lawyers pro bono experts. Patrick McNamara here, history professor at the University of Minnesota, has worked with attorneys in Chicago to help prove what goes on in these countries, right? I recruited archaeologists from Northwestern University who went into the jungles, and they would talk about what happens. Pro bono advertising people. How do you make an exhibit? I had a Peter Principle of Persecution case, a young man who every organization he joined that previous president had been killed. She made a big 2x4 document that I couldn't do, but her advertising firm could do pro bono documents. So I urge you, I mean, maybe already doing that, lots of pro bono. Court watchers, religious women going into court watch and watching those ex parte conversations. You have a program here that works with survivors of torture. Same with us, Culver Center for Survivors of Torture, working with therapists on PTSD, but also Dr. Robert Kirshner, who was deputy medical examiner in Chicago, on his spare time did human rights forensic work. And working with him, that he could tell you the fracture in that shoulder, only way the bones healed that way was torture by the way they hung him over their back. Or the only way that wrist was broken was torture. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't an accident, that sort of thing. So how do you expand the pro bono? People want to help, right? And so, oh, go back. No picture. All right. I had Mayor Harold Washington, real quickly, he offered his first executive order, working with us in coalition, that the city of Chicago would not cooperate with INS, because INS had discriminated against his administration, had gone into taxi cab records without permission and pulled out all the undocumented taxi cab drivers and then went and arrested them. And now we have the whole movement of sanctuary cities, but it started with Mayor Harold Washington. And finally, the new sanctuary movement, this is from the Southside Presbyterian Church, is alive and well today. And I'm sorry I went over time, but there's so much to tell you in the early days of that. But thank you very much, and happy to answer questions later.
We have about 11 minutes, so we're going to make this super quick.
Nothing happened after night.
It's all good. All right. Good night. All right. Really, we've been talking about that the system really isn't broken. It's intended to work this way. And really, what we see is there are a lot of unintended consequences of this system that people didn't think about or did think about. And we hear a lot in the news today about surges. We have a huge surge. We're being overwhelmed. And I've been doing this work as an immigration attorney and now working with the city of St. Paul since the late 80s. And I was around when legalization just came into be. And, to me, throughout my career, it just seems like we've always had surges. People are describing as surges. And really what it is people are coming here because they don't have a choice. They need help. They're really suffering. They want a better life. But our law seems to think that people are just coming here to work. They want to take advantage. They want to come here and take advantage of our welfare benefits and our, good nature. And when you start to work with people, you realize that's just not true. But our government realized that we had a whole lot of people here who were unauthorized. And in the 80s, as we continued to start taking in refugees and asylum seekers and things were starting to change a little bit, we passed IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, where we granted people amnesty. 3 million people were granted permanent residence through IRCA. But at the same time, our government realized, hey, there's these push-pull reasons that people come, people are being pushed out of their countries because there's no work, they're being tortured, there's war, natural disasters, climate change. But at the same time, there are things that pull people here, And so while we did create, opportunities for 3 million people, we also created employer sanctions. We were trying to neutralize that pull. We had to find a way to stop people from being hired who weren't here with authorization. So we decided to create employer sanctions, making it illegal for employers to hire people. But as we moved on, and thinking that, all right, we've taken care of 3 million people, we're going to stop people from coming. So we're going to really kind of curtail all these unauthorized people coming to America. But at the same time, we realized that we had to do more to kind of deal with the pull aspect. So in the 90s, we started to see a lot of legislation around dealing with removal, deportation. We passed in 1988 the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created categories of offenses called aggravated felonies that subjected non-citizens to deportation after completing their prison sentence. And although the bill defined aggravated felonies as murder, drug trafficking, and illicit trafficking in arms, Congress has since increased the number of crimes that are covered by aggravated felonies. And by 2016, there were more than 30 types of offenses that were deemed aggravated felonies, including minor crimes where with a sentence of 1 year or more, which meant in the state of Minnesota, someone who had a gross misdemeanor for certain types of crimes were considered aggravated felons. And we begin to see our government really start to criminalize immigration and really start to deport large numbers of people. But at the same time, we see the government also saying we still need to create opportunities for people to come. Backwards. So in the 90s, we the slide. Sorry about that. All right. So we started with IRCA. We created Amnesty. We had a huge surge of people that needed legal help. And the Minnesota response was we had to increase the organizations that were here working with people. And we met the challenge. In 1976, Smurls created Oficina Legal, which was then in 1996 spun off to become the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, Centro Legal, which I'm an alumni of Centro Legal, and numerous other attorneys. Dozens and dozens of immigration attorneys came through Centro Legal and got their start at Centro Legal. It was founded in '81, and even though it closed in 2009, it created a whole community of immigration lawyers that would go on and represent many, many people in Minnesota. Advocates for Human Rights were founded in 1983. And so we came and we met the challenge. And even though we did all this, we continued to criminalize and try to keep people out. We created employer sanctions. The number of undocumented in the United States to continue to grow. From 1990, where we had 3.5 million undocumented, to 1995, we grew to 5.7 million undocumented people living in the United States. So our government responded by trying to, again, create legislation that made it unlawful to enter in the United States, created mandatory detention for many classes of non-citizens, and expedited deportation procedures for certain classes of immigrants. We also created a 3- and 10-year bar for making it unlawful for people to leave the United States, and when they came back, they'd be subject to couldn't come back for 3 to 10 years. We created a concept of unlawful presence. People who were here unauthorized would get unlawful presence, and if they had more than 6 months to a year or more than a year of unlawful presence, they would be prevented from coming back. So it made it very difficult for family members to petition for individuals. So we saw that they created a lot of hardship separating families because people could not come back due to the bars. And we also saw that our government started to see that we had to somehow shut down the borders because people were continuing to come. The number of undocumented continued to grow. So in the 1990s, we see legislation being passed to really attempt to stop the flow of people into the United States. You see, in 1996, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and Illegal Immigration and Reform Act passed, which increased, again, penalties for unlawful entry. We see the government pass the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity and Reconciliation Act, which made most non-citizens ineligible for means-tested welfare, authorized the states to deny public welfare, such as Medicaid, to immigrants, and delayed the possibility of receiving welfare for most immigrants for 5 years. We really were trying to stop people from coming and being able to get welfare benefits, as thinking that would deter people from coming. But people continued to come. So in the Clinton administration then started to think about administrative ways that they might be able to prevent people from coming. And in 1983, the administration implemented an operation called Operation Hold the Line. And that took place in El Paso, Texas. And it was a way for the Border Patrol to really prevent people from entering the United States. Prior to Operation Hold the Line, the Border Patrol were in, cities. They would be like regular law enforcement patrolling the inner city and finding people and picking people up as they were in the city. But in 93, they took the Border Patrol, moved them down to the border and actually put Border Patrol agents every 200 yards and really shut down the border. They did a similar operation in 1994 in San Diego, and again, shut down the border. The result of that was that people were pushed out of the, coming through the city, pushed out into the rural areas, very dangerous to come, coming through the desert. They were also then forced to find ways to get people to help them. So he started using smugglers to help them come in. But by 1997, the number of Border Patrol agents along the southwest border had increased to over 6,000, roughly double the size of the Border Patrol that started in 1987. These additional enforcement measures increased the cost of crossing the border illegally, increased illegal immigrants' use of smugglers, and inflated smugglers' fees, and decreased the incentive for undocumented immigrants to return home after successfully entering the United States. The result being that people just decided it was so hard to get in that once they got in, they weren't going to leave. So the number of undocumented continued to grow. And the point here is that we've seen large numbers of people, surges. Our country is capable of accepting them and helping them to become part of our community. So this is just another surge that has a so-called surge, which has been created by as part of the unintended consequences. We don't allow people to work. That's why they need to stay in shelters and seek public and charity assistance. We don't allow people to come here and move freely. So we do need to just think about these unintended consequences as we move forward. As I was preparing for this presentation, I got very depressed and kind of negative about what was going on. So I got very angry. Yes, I did. And I ended up talking to I was on it.
Bottom button.
Preview.
Bottom button.
Yep. Yep. All right. Here we go. All right. So I got angry. I called my good friend and counterpart in Minneapolis, Michelle Ribeiro. We had a conversation about how do I deal with this anger? How do I kind of focus on what I wanted to present? All right. So Michelle responds to me, well, when the answer to anger is love. You have to love your enemy. You have to love your neighbor. And I thought to myself, wow, she's right. It's about love. So I was very fortunate to have seen Sister Norma Pimentel, the executive director at Catholic Charities of Rio Grande Valley in Texas. She was here last month and spoke. And she told a quick story about how there was the Border Patrol called her right after Title 42 had been lifted. There was all these families coming in, and they had nowhere to put them. So they called Sister and said, "Sister, we need you to come and take in these families." So she thought quickly, "What do I do?" There's a church down by the border that I know, and I'll call Father down at the Catholic church and say, "Can I bring people over?" So they did. She starts to bring people over, and she's scrambling. I need beds, I need food, we need diapers, we need all these things. And a representative from the city comes. Sister, what are you doing here? You got all these people. And she just looked around and thought to herself, and she responded to me and said, well, we're restoring human dignity. Everybody was focused on all these numbers and all this, need and everything, and just massive flows they're talking about. And Sister brought it back down to, this is just about restoring human dignity. And one of the things that she said was, you have to really look at the individual and realize that they have suffered greatly and really need someone to help them realize that they're still a human being worthy of love and just So love it was the answer. But as I thought about this some more and tried to think about how I could take that idea of love, I came across a quote from Saint Teresa of Calcutta, known to the rest of us as Mother Teresa. And she said that few of us can do great things, but all of us can do small things with great love. And I think if all of us do small things in this time of need with great love, and we do it collectively together, we can do great things. Thanks.